The day I received the call confirming my acceptance for the new ranger post was hands down the best day of my life. I've always had a deep love for the outdoors. Being more of an introvert than an extrovert, I'll gladly take the serenity of vast forests and dense woodlands over the chaotic hustle of a bustling city any day. But the vision I had of my new life as a U.S. Forest Service ranger is quite different from the reality I've encountered out here. I've decided to document my experiences so far because I'm 6 days into a 3-month stint in a fire watch tower, and already things have taken a disturbing turn. To say the least, it's been unsettling. I've chosen to start this diary for 2 main reasons. 1, it helps keep my mind occupied during these quiet, dark nights in the tower. And 2, in case something happens to me, I want there to be a record of what's occurred. Right now, I probably sound like a paranoid rookie, maybe a little too rattled by the eerie sounds of the forest at night and the isolation that comes with this job. Maybe it's already messing with my head, edging me closer to insanity. Or maybe something genuinely strange is happening in these woods. I've heard some pretty unnerving stories in the short time I've been out here, but recently, since being stationed at this tower, I've come across something that makes all those tales pale in comparison. Something much more disturbing. But hey, listen to what I've experienced so far and judge for yourself. At present, I'm stationed as a ranger in one of the largest forests in the northwestern U.S. We're talking miles upon miles of dense woodland managed by the Forest Service, specifically a handful of ranger district offices, one of which I'm now part of. Most of my duties involve patrolling the trails, assisting hikers and campers if needed, and occasionally joining search and rescue operations. As of now, I've been assigned to a fire watch tower for 3 months, while the service recruits a permanent ranger for this role. Oh, and my name's David, by the way. I'm 28. The day I arrived in the town where the ranger's office is located, I checked into a small budget motel. It was a quaint, slightly worn-down place that fit perfectly with the town's rugged yet rustic charm. The air was chilly, barely above freezing, and a misty fog had settled over the quiet streets when I pulled in that late autumn morning. My induction was scheduled for the next morning at 9 a.m. at the office. After that, I'd have the weekend to familiarize myself with the area before being picked up at 6 a.m. on Monday for a week-long retreat in a large national park, where I would undergo basic ranger training. I handed over my driver's license and $100 to the elderly man behind the motel's front desk. With what seemed like a forced smile, he asked what had brought me to this neck of the woods. I told him, in the same polite tone, that I was here for a job, that I'd been hired by the local national park and would be heading out of town for training soon. I only needed the room for a few days. His expression shifted slightly, something almost imperceptible, but disconcerting. "Another one, huh?" he muttered. I looked up, puzzled, and asked what he meant. He glanced at me with an odd smile and said, "Seems like every few months I get a young fella just like yourself coming through here, needing a room before heading off to work in those woods." He handed me my room key and put my money away. I chalked it up to the idea that the local Forest Service must be doing a lot of recruiting for the upcoming season. Thanking him, I asked for the Wi-Fi code, but the old man just shrugged, signaling that I was far from the conveniences of home. After settling into my room, I decided to drive around town in search of food. The rural, unincorporated town had a few local businesses, mostly camping supplies, bait shops, and the occasional small grocery store. My hiking boots had seen better days, so I figured I'd pick up a new pair to make a good impression at the induction. I pulled over in front of a small store and, as I climbed the steps, noticed a bulletin board in the window. There were the usual cards for handyman services and rooms for rent, but what really caught my eye were 3 missing persons posters. I stepped back to take a closer look. 3 college-aged kids, 2 guys and a girl, had been missing for about 5 weeks after heading into the woods for a camping trip. Probably a bear attack, I thought to myself, trying to brush off any darker thoughts. Inside the store, I found a sturdy pair of black hiking boots and took them to the counter. The man behind it, middle-aged and unshaven, was half watching a sports game on a tiny TV while munching on potato chips that clung to his beard. After clearing my throat a few times to get his attention, he reluctantly rang up my boots, still keeping one eye on the game. "So, have they found those kids yet?" I asked, making small talk. "Nah, nor any of the others," he replied without looking up. "Others?" I questioned, feeling my stomach drop slightly. I pressed for more details, asking if people went missing in these woods often. He shrugged it off. Happens all the time. Lot of forest out there, he said, sounding almost indifferent. And they're never found alive? Or just never found at all? I asked, growing more uneasy. The ones they find, well, it's usually clear what happened. Bear attack, mountain lion exposure. But the others? Nah. If they don't find them in the first week, they're probably never found at all. Some folks around here say it's a copycat killer, but I don't buy any of that, he replied as he bagged my boots and handed them over. Copycat killer? I asked, confused. He scoffed. You're not from around here, are ya? He grinned, like my question told him all he needed to know. I just shook my head, feeling a bit out of my depth. The man chuckled, got up from his seat, and wandered over to a wall behind the counter. 1963, that's the year. George Munson was the name, he announced, picking up a framed newspaper clipping and sliding it across the counter for me to see. The headline read, Munson sentenced to death, with the smaller text explaining that he'd been convicted of murdering 5 children. Georgie was the local oddball, or so my dad used to say, the man began as I studied the old mugshot of a young man in his 20s. He had one of those faces that might have gotten older, but he didn't, if you know what I mean. He stopped growing up around 10, mentally speaking. Special needs and all that. His mama would take him hiking in the woods. One day she comes running back into town, hollering that Georgie's been taken by something out there in the forest. What happened? I asked, curious how this connected to the article in front of me. Well, the townsfolk and the rangers searched for him for 5 weeks. Not a trace. Then out of nowhere, Georgie walks back into town, like nothing ever happened. The man's face was full of disbelief. You're kidding, I muttered. Nope, straight up truth. His mama was overjoyed to have her boy back. Well, boy. He was about 6'5" by then, big fella. But something wasn't right with Georgie. He didn't talk, didn't eat. His mama, thinking he needed company, invited some kids over to play one day. The man's expression darkened. That's when it happened. Georgie and the kids went into the woods. Folks say they were laughing, skipping along, singing songs. Just kids being kids, right? But those kids, they never came back. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What happened to them? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The man leaned in closer. Search party went out, found them, mangled, torn apart. Unspeakable evil, they said. Some of the rescue team even threw up when they saw what was left. 5 kids went into those woods, but they only found 5 bodies. Where was Georgie? I asked, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Nobody knew. Until, like before, Georgie walks back out of the woods, covered head to toe in the blood of those kids. I let that sink in, the weight of the story heavy between us. Did he say why he did it? I asked, baffled by what I was hearing. Well, here's the thing. Georgie claimed he didn't do it. Said he never came back from the woods the first time. The man slapped the counter for emphasis. Weird, right? But it makes for a hell of a story around the campfire. He chuckled, the mood lightening suddenly, as if the story were just another local legend. Anyway, stick to the trails, he added with a friendly grin. I forced a laugh. Actually, I'm going to be working as a ranger out in the forest, I said, trying to join in on the humor. His smile faltered. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, good luck then, he muttered, avoiding eye contact as he turned back to his sports game. I left the store, my boots in hand, and sank into the driver's seat of my car with a long, anxious sigh. Starting the engine, I pulled away from the curb, heading deeper into the town, searching for a place to eat. The village felt even more desolate as the cold autumn air settled in, making everything seem grayer and more worn. I eventually spotted a small diner at the corner of a crossroads. The sign read, Rose's Diner. I parked, eager to get inside. I couldn't have gotten out of the car fast enough. I jogged up the steps, opened the door, and slid into a booth. A waitress, who looked like she should have retired a good 6 years ago, came over to take my order. What'll it be, hun? She asked, her voice rough and gravelly. A smoker for sure, judging by the sound of her vocal cords and the wear of her smile. Can I get pancakes and a side of bacon? And coffee, please. Sure thing, hun, she replied. I handed her the menu as she poured coffee into my mug, giving me a once-over. You're new around here, she remarked, her tone more serious, clearly not recognizing me in this small, close-knit town. Yes, ma'am, I began, hesitating for a second. After my experience in the store, I was wary about telling the truth. I'm, fishing. Came here for the trout, all the way from Long Island. Her face lit up, and she seemed pleased with my answer. Oh, well, I hope you've heard all good things. I've lived here my whole life. Opened this diner back in '84 after my daddy passed and left me some money. I'm Rose, she said, pointing to the embroidered Rose's diner badge on her uniform. Oh, I see. Well, it's a lovely place you've got here, I said, more sincerely this time. I'm David. Just wait till you try the pancakes, she teased, finishing up the note for my order and heading off to the kitchen. I wrapped my hands around the hot mug, letting the warmth seep in, and turned to look out the window at the scene beyond. Over the rooftops of the town, I could see fields stretching into the distance and hills blanketed with trees. The thick wood seemed to swallow the mountains whole, an endless sea of green and brown. I smiled to myself, knowing that's where I truly belonged. As my gaze dropped back to the street, I noticed a mother pushing a stroller with two twins. As she passed, I caught sight of a few telegraph poles and streetlights, each one with paper attached to it. I squinted and made out the word "missing" on each flyer. Though I couldn't see the images clearly, I recognized the names. They were the same missing people from the posters outside the store. I snapped out of my thoughts as Rose placed a plate of food in front of me, the sound of it hitting the table breaking my daze. One order of pancakes with a side of bacon. And here's your syrup, she said cheerfully, refilling my coffee. Can I get you anything else? She asked, smiling. No, that's fine. Thank you, I replied. She smiled and wished me a nice meal before heading back to the kitchen. But something nagged at me, and just before she was out of earshot, I called out quietly, "Hey, Rose?" She turned back, tilting her head slightly. "Yes, hun." I'm a bit of a sucker for the paranormal, I admitted with a sheepish smile. I love ghost hunts and stuff. Not a lot of that back home, but you've lived here all your life, right? There's got to be some legends around here. What's the local folklore? Her eyes twinkled as she chuckled. Oh, honey, if you like spooky stuff, you've come to the right place. There's plenty of stories round here. She leaned in closer, resting her elbows on the edge of the table. Ever hear about the Black Elk Witch or the Blood Moon cult up in the mountains? No, I haven't, I said, genuinely intrigued. Well, let me tell you. Back when my daddy was younger than you, there was a woman named Elizabeth Wells. Lived round here in the 1910s, complete recluse, and everyone said she was a whack job. Devil worship, witchcraft, all that nasty stuff. In 1945, the town finally had enough of her antics and banished her. She moved into a house deep in the woods, and everyone thought that'd be the end of it. Rose paused for effect. But then, 15 years later, she shows up in town. Naked, filthy, and looking like she hadn't seen another human being in years. She walks right up the steps of the church and starts cursing the whole town. What happened next? I asked, completely engrossed. Well, they chased her back into the woods, up into the mountains like she was some kind of wild animal. She disappeared again, and folks assumed she died of starvation or exposure. But then, 5 years later, kids started going missing, one by one, and they were never found. Rose leaned in even closer, her voice lowering. So the townspeople, thinking Miss Wells was the culprit, grabbed their torches and headed into the woods to find her. They got to her house, started yelling for her to come out, but she swore up and down she was innocent. Some of them started to believe her, until one of the men found a child's shoe near the porch. That was all the proof they needed. I listened intently as Rose's expression turned darker. They tried to kick in her door, but it wouldn't budge, so they broke a window and started pouring gasoline into her house. One of them lit a match and, woof, up it went in flames. Jesus, I muttered, horrified. What happened to her? They say you could hear her screaming inside the house as the fire burned it to the ground. The sheriff, one of the parents of the missing kids, covered it up, called it an accidental fire. But when they searched the place, they found the basement mostly untouched. She paused for a moment, as if reliving the story herself. That's where they found the real horror. Miss Wells had been keeping the kids down there, doing unspeakable things to them. Rituals, witchcraft symbols everywhere. There were bloody handprints all over the place. And the worst part? There were signs that she'd been eating them. I felt my stomach turn. And the sheriff covered all that up? Rose nodded solemnly. He conspired with the fire department to make it look like the fire had spread from her cooking. But anyone who knows the story? Well, they know what really happened. I guess things were different back then. None of those forensic experts around to say otherwise, Rose said with a shrug. Good God, that's awful, I muttered, still processing the story. Yeah, they tore the place down a year after her death. But about 10 years after the fire, there was this hiker, Justin Moffat, who ventured off the trail up in those woods. Never seen again. Folks started saying he got too close to where Wells's house used to be, and her ghost killed him, just like she killed those kids, Rose continued. After the official investigation was closed, 3 others went searching for Justin on their own. They went missing too. And that's how the story of the Black Elk Witch became one of those tales parents tell their kids to keep them from wandering off. Don't stray from the trail, don't talk to strangers, and go to bed on time. You know the drill. So, it's just a myth then? I asked, still unsure what to believe. Well, my daddy was born after the fire, but he swore his daddy and granddad before him believed Elizabeth Wells did those things to those kids, and that her spirit's still out there, killing hikers. But like I said, it could all just be a scary story to keep kids in line. It sure worked on me, she said with a playful chuckle. I wasn't as entertained, but I kept that to myself. You mentioned a cult too? I asked cautiously. Oh yeah, Rose replied. Now I can't speak to it firsthand, but back in the late 60s, there were rumors of a group that worshipped the same dark forces Elizabeth Wells did. Folks said they lived deep in the forest, up in the mountains. Supposedly they're still out there, stalking lost hikers for their rituals, sacrifices to the Black Elk Witch. Her words hung in the air, her intense gaze locked onto mine. Then she suddenly slapped my shoulder, bursting into laughter. Oh, don't worry, hun. It's just another spooky tale folks around here like to tell. No one's ever actually seen this so-called cult. Just something to get folks like you, paranormal enthusiasts, excited. She winked at me, her voice light again. Now, enjoy your meal before it gets cold. With that, she left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my pancakes. Despite the unsettling conversation, the food was great. I left a generous tip for Rose and waved goodbye as I left the diner. Hopefully, I'd get a chance to talk to her again. On my way back to the car, I took a detour to check out the posters I'd seen earlier. The first one was for a boy named Dennis Weaver, 13 years old. Last seen on a hiking trip with his family. His parents woke up one morning to find him missing from his tent. The poster was dated 5 weeks ago. I snapped a picture of it on my phone and moved on to the next one. The second poster was for another boy, Chad Mitchell, probably around 15. He'd gone on a hike with some friends and apparently stepped off the trail during the night, likely to relieve himself. He was never seen again. I took a photo of that one too. Back at the motel, I purchased an internet add-on for my phone plan and pulled out my laptop. I started searching the web for anything about missing persons in the town. To my surprise, nothing relevant came up. I searched for Dennis Weaver by name, and still, nothing. Then I tried Chad Mitchell. Again, no results. It was strange. It felt like the town was keeping these investigations under wraps. But why? I had no idea. As a last resort, I decided to look up Elizabeth Wells. The top result was a sort of urban legend wiki page titled The Black Elk Witch. Intrigued, I clicked on it. The main image was a haunting sketch of Elizabeth Wells, her hair wild and tangled like Medusa's, her limbs stretched out in a crucifix position. Her body was drawn naked, with ragged cloth draped over her back like a cape. Her face was twisted in anger, her features deformed, and the sketch showed flames licking at her flesh. The crude pencil dots for her pupils seemed to stare right through the screen, sending a chill down my spine. I read the article and quickly realized it matched Rose's version of the story almost perfectly, though there were a few variations. In one version, the townspeople drowned her in the lake, while another claimed they nailed her to a crucifix and left her to freeze in the winter. Despite those differences, the core of the story remained the same. I shut the laptop, deciding I'd had enough for one night. I didn't want to end up waking in a cold sweat. The next day, I headed to the district office of the Forestry Service, ready to meet my employers and co-workers in person. I gave my name to the ranger at the front desk. She smiled and quickly told me the head ranger was waiting for me in his office. I made my way to the door she pointed out, knocked, and heard a gruff voice from inside. "Come in." I stepped into the room to find a stern-looking man behind the desk, filling out paperwork. His salt and pepper stubble and no-nonsense haircut screamed military background. "Hi, I'm Dave," I introduced myself. I extended my hand. "Dave, pleased to meet you." The man grabbed my hand firmly, shaking it with authority. "Bill, nice to meet you. And welcome aboard. Always good to have another New Yorker around here," he said with a chuckle. "Honestly, some of these guys are so deep south, they make me sound like Tony Soprano, you know?" I laughed, instantly feeling a bit more at ease. "Glad to hear it. That office sure liked you in the interviews," Bill continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Now, I'm going to be honest. Picking recruits isn't really my job. But training them and weeding out the ones who don't make the cut, that's my territory. You get me?" "Yeah, I understand," I nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze sizing me up. "Good," he said, his intense stare holding for a moment longer before he seemed to ease up. "You seem like a good kid, David. Just follow your training, do what I say, and you'll be a solid part of the team." He rummaged through his desk drawer, pulling out a stack of papers. "New starter pack, contract, training info for that retreat you're heading to Monday. Sign where the X's are." I took the pen and started filling out the paperwork while Bill watched. As I worked, something nagged at me, and I decided to ask. "Can I ask you a question?" "Shoot." "Do you get a lot of missing persons around here?" I asked carefully. Bill scoffed. "It's the woods, kid. Mountain lions, bears, wolves. We tell people to stick to the trails, but some think they know better." His tone grew teasing. "What's the matter? You think the big bad wolves are going to get you already? Or ... He paused, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. "Has someone been putting ideas in your head? Who've you been talking to?" His sudden shift in attitude threw me off. No one," I stammered. "I mean, I went into town yesterday and saw all the posters up. It just seemed like a lot for such a small community." Bill's expression softened, and he let out a short breath. "Ah, that. Yeah, small town folks always think they know the woods better than us. The sheriff's department? Just a couple of part-timers who think they run the place. People out here don't always listen to authority, and when things go sideways, when they get eaten by Yogi and his pals, they start making up boogeyman stories. But it's just the woods, kid. It's a dangerous place, and that's why the government put us out here. But people still think they know better." His blunt explanation eased my mind somewhat. "So yeah, we get a lot of missing folks. But don't worry. In basic training, they'll teach you search and rescue techniques." "Great. I'm looking forward to it," I replied, feeling more reassured. Bill chuckled, a bit wistfully. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago. Young, full of optimism." I smiled and handed over the signed forms. "You're officially a forest ranger now. The bus leaves Monday morning at 6. Be here by 5:30. You'll be in Denver by 2, and training starts Tuesday morning. You'll be back here Friday night, and we'll have your accommodations ready by then." "It's been a pleasure, David. Looking forward to working with you," Bill said, offering another firm handshake. I left the office feeling optimistic and decided to treat myself to another round of Rose's pancakes. The bus ride to Rocky Mountain National Park was uneventful, though we arrived a few minutes behind schedule. Along with a group of other rangers, some of whom had been on the job for a year or less, we made our way to the visitor center. This advanced course would teach us search and rescue techniques, fire watching, and even climbing. I'd gotten to know a few of the others during the trip: Jeff, P., Richard, and Daniel. Great guys, full of enthusiasm like me. We were all excited about the training and the chance to hear stories from the seasoned rangers. The retreat was incredible. We spent our days on team-building exercises, search and rescue missions, hikes, and learning survival skills. It was probably the most fun I'd ever had. But the best part? Sitting around the campfire at night, swapping stories with the veteran rangers. Their tales blew my mind. Successful rescues, close encounters with wildlife, and even investigations into criminal activities. But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, the conversation took a strange turn. We started talking about the oddest, most unsettling things they'd encountered on the job. While none of these rangers were from my jurisdiction, the stories still sent a chill down my spine. One story stood out in particular, told by a senior ranger from the Rockies. When asked about the most haunting search and rescue mission he'd worked, this is what he said. "It has to be the disappearance of a kid back in 2006. I was a rookie back then, stationed at Crater Lake National Park. I was shadowing one of the senior guys, a grizzled vet who'd seen it all. He taught me everything I knew. Anyway, a call came in that a family had been camping in the hills and were hiking back down the trail to their car. At some point, they lost sight of their youngest son. They thought he might have stopped to tie his shoes or wandered off the trail for a bathroom break. But when they called out for him, he didn't answer. The dad tried to stay calm, but the mother, she was already losing it by the time we got there." The ranger paused for a moment, staring into the fire as if reliving that day. The ranger paused, clearly still rattled by the memory. I could tell the guy was just as freaked out as his partner, but he was holding it together better. Anyway, I get there and do a quick search of the surrounding area. Nothing. No tracks, no sign of the kid, not even the dogs picked up his scent. The parents said he'd been lagging behind, tired from hiking. Why they didn't keep an eye on their 8-year-old is beyond me, but we chalked it up to exhaustion and complacency. They said they looked back 1 second, and he was there. Then a minute later, gone. Naturally, when we couldn't find him, we escalated it to the police. It was being treated as a potential abduction. But I swear to God, me, my partner, our team, the volunteers, and even the cops, we searched for days. 30 miles in every direction. No sign of that kid. After 10 days, we called off the search. The parents were devastated, but we had covered every inch of those woods. We put up posters with the kid's photo. He'd been wearing a bright blue winter coat. We figured if anyone saw that coat, it'd stand out against the green and brown of the forest. Of course, if he was still wearing it after all those nights. Well, that was another story. 3 weeks later, while we were out on patrol, we get a call from the visitor center saying a hiker thinks they found the kid. We rush over to the area. It's at the foot of a steep rock face, about 90 feet high. The hiker points up halfway, and sure enough, there's that blue jacket wedged into a small cavity in the rock. The ranger shook his head. I climbed up there myself, and let me tell you, no way could an 8-year-old have gotten up there alone. Hell, it was tough even for me, and I had training and equipment. But I get up there, and when I pull the jacket out, I nearly fainted. We all sat in stunned silence as the ranger continued. The cavity in the rock was no more than 10 inches deep and maybe 3 inches wide. Yet the jacket was stuffed in there, and the smell, oh man, it hit me like a brick wall. It was this overpowering, rusty, metallic smell, like copper. At first, I thought maybe it was something about the rocks, some kind of geological thing. But no. As I pulled the jacket out, I realized the smell wasn't from the rocks, it was from the kid. The ranger's voice dropped lower. His body was stuffed in that small hole, eyes staring out like they'd been squeezed, bulging. There was no blood around the opening, no visible wounds. But when the cops brought in specialists to get him out, they found his insides had basically exploded. Every bone in his body was broken, but there were no cuts, no scratches. 2 pints of blood had leaked out of his nose, ears, and mouth. That's what caused the copper smell. His blood vessels had burst. He took a deep breath before continuing. What really freaked everyone out was when the medical examiner told us that, despite being missing for 3 weeks, the kid had only been dead for a few hours when we found him. And get this, there were fresh berries in his stomach, and he wasn't dehydrated or malnourished. Someone, or something, kept him alive all that time, only to kill him in the most horrific way right before we found him. We were all completely speechless, and the ranger finished with a grim note. Cause of death was officially listed as exposure, which is a damn joke. My partner, who was tight with one of the detectives, asked him about it over drinks. The detective told him, "We've been told not to ask questions." Something or someone out there kept that boy clean, fed, and hydrated for 3 weeks, then stuffed him in a rock in a way no human could. But yeah, they said he died of exposure. He stared into the fire. That's the one that keeps me up at night. Around the campfire, none of us newbies could find the words. But I noticed some of the more experienced rangers didn't look shocked, just resigned, like they'd heard it all before. One of the senior rangers across the fire slapped his knee. I think I heard about that one. Made the rounds at another training retreat, but here's one you haven't heard. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. Before I start, though, you all need to swear you'll keep this to yourselves. I don't know how bad it could get if people found out I talked. We all nodded and swore to secrecy. The ranger glanced around, still uneasy. All right, here goes. So, I'd been a ranger for about a year. I was up checking on a couple camping along one of the more remote trails. I'm about 100 yards from their camp when I see the guy waving me down in a panic. I pull the ATV over and ask him what's wrong. The guy's eyes are wide and he says, "You're not gonna believe what we found. Come look." He led me back to their campsite, and I could hear his partner. She was crying. The ranger paused for a moment, his expression grim as he continued. So, this guy pulls back the tent flap, and boom, his wife is sitting there cradling a baby. The problem? They didn't have a baby with them yesterday. I'm baffled, and I ask, when was she pregnant? But they tell me dead serious that the baby isn't theirs. They go on to explain that they woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of crying. They got up to investigate and found the noise was coming from the tree line, about 20 feet away. When they went to check it out, they found this baby lying at the foot of a tree, just there. They tried calling the visitor center, but their phones were dead, so they waited for me to show up. I'm standing there, dumbfounded, and I realize I can't take this baby down the 5-mile trail on my ATV. So I try to radio the visitor center, but I can't get through, probably because of the mountains and the thick trees. I tell the couple to keep the baby warm and safe, and I'll go back to get help. I tear back down to base, call CPS, and tell them what's going on. As I'm explaining, they start asking me the usual questions. Is the baby hurt? Is it in need of urgent medical attention? And that's when it hits me. This baby is completely unharmed. Not a scratch, no dirt, nothing. It's like it was just placed there, clean as a whistle. But I just tell them, no, the baby's fine, but you need to get here ASAP. They say it'll take about an hour for someone to get out there. Meanwhile, another ranger tells me to head back with blankets and some supplies for the couple. So I grab what I need and head back up the trail. When I get there, it's eerily quiet. No baby crying, no talking. I pull back the tent flap and I nearly screamed. Hand to God, the couple is just gone. Completely butchered. Torn apart. There's blood everywhere, and I mean everywhere. But the baby? No sign of it. That was my first thought, that whatever did this took the baby too. I jump on my ATV and race back down the trail until I can get a signal. I radio the visitor center, screaming for animal control, the police, anyone. The base tells me to calm down and that the authorities are already on their way. They tell me to stay at the scene and make sure no one tampers with the evidence. So, I go back, but I'm not going near that tent again. I just stand at the edge of the camp, waiting. After about 30 minutes, my colleagues and a couple of suits show up. But here's where things get weird. No CPS van, no animal control, no cops. Just this black Range Rover that pulls up behind my ATV. 2 guys in suits get out and they head straight for the tent. They don't even flinch when they see the bodies. They just look at each other, nod, and start taking notes. I didn't notice it at first, but when I looked down, I saw bloody footprints leading out of the tent. I pointed out, but the suits just brush me off. Then one of them turns to me and says, "Yeah, that's fine. We'll take it from here. Go back to base and close off the trail." I'm confused, right? So I ask them, "What about the baby? Are you calling CPS?" They just stare at me for a few seconds. Even though they're wearing shades, I could feel them glaring. One of them finally says in this robotic tone, "They're on their way." I didn't argue. I left the site and started telling hikers to turn back because the trail was closed. Back at the visitor center, more of those black SUVs arrived and headed up the trail. A few days later, the trail was closed for a week because of an unexplained forest fire, or so they said. It scorched the entire site, 5 miles in every direction. The ranger took a deep breath, looking around at us, his face pale. This was in the middle of October. Since then, I've always assumed that couple was murdered, and the baby was kidnapped. I thought those suits were FBI at first. But in the years since, I've dealt with the FBI a couple of times, whether it was for bodies dumped by killers or fugitives hiding out in the park. And let me tell you, those suits, they weren't FBI. Every Fed I've ever met loves to tell you who they are, but these guys didn't even give me their names. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. The questions I have about that day? They've kept me up more nights than I can count. Every time I asked for an update, I got told to stop asking or fed some BS story about a bear attack. But even if a bear had done it, it doesn't explain where the baby came from, or where it went. We all sat there, wide-eyed, rubbing our knees and exhaling as we tried to shake off the anxiety his story had built. The tension was thick as a few of the others started bringing up David Paulides, the investigator who wrote about unexplained disappearances in national parks. Many of the rookies began murmuring about how much his research resonated with them, and how the mysteries surrounding the woods seemed to run deeper than any of us could have imagined. The ranger's voice dropped, and the firelight flickered across his face as he continued his tale. I could feel the tension in the air. My wife was trying to act casual, but I knew something was seriously wrong. She kept her eyes on the fire, her voice shaky as she talked about anything she could. Our anniversary, what we'd do when we got back home. But I could barely focus. I kept hearing it. The soft crunch of twigs, the subtle crackle of dry leaves. Whatever it was circling us. He paused, his expression dark. I wanted to turn around so badly to see what was stalking us, but my wife grabbed my hand, squeezing it hard, whispering, Don't look." She begged me to keep staring at the fire, to act like nothing was wrong, and so I did. I don't know how long we sat there like that, probably 10 or 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The sound would get closer, then drift away, like it was teasing us, waiting for us to break. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me was telling me to jump up, to run, to fight, to do something. But my wife just kept talking, her voice soft and tense, telling me to stay calm. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The woods went dead silent. No more footsteps. No more crunching leaves. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. My wife didn't say a word for a long time, just staring into the fire, her hands trembling. Finally, after what felt like forever, she whispered, "It's gone." But neither of us moved for a good 5 minutes. We just sat there, frozen, waiting to be sure. When we finally did get up, we quickly doused the fire and crawled into the tent. We didn't talk about it anymore that night. We were too scared to even acknowledge what had happened. The ranger rubbed the back of his neck, looking deeply unsettled. The next morning, we packed up camp at the crack of dawn and hiked straight back to the car. We didn't even stop for breakfast. We just wanted out of those woods. And I swear to you, the whole way back, I felt like we were being watched. Every gust of wind, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. He took a deep breath, glancing around the group. We never talked about it again after that trip. My wife, tough as nails, refused to go back to Black Elk. And I'll be honest, I've never gone back either. We stuck to other parks after that, places that felt safer. But that experience, whatever was out there, whatever followed us, I still don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to. We all sat in stunned silence, our minds trying to wrap around the terrifying possibilities. One of the newbies, Pete, finally broke the silence. "So, you think it was that ghost? The one from the legend?" The ranger shrugged, his eyes distant. "I don't know. Maybe. My wife was always into the supernatural. She'd heard all those stories growing up. But I'm more of a practical guy. I don't believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't. All I know is that we weren't alone that night. Whether it was some kind of animal, a person, or something else entirely, I can't say. But I'll tell you this. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I've never felt fear like that before. Not even close." The fire crackled, casting eerie shadows on the ground as we sat there, processing what we'd just heard. None of us said a word, but the haunted expressions on the veteran rangers' faces told us everything. They'd all seen or heard things out in the woods that defied explanation, things that weren't in any manual or training guide. Eventually, the ranger gave a bitter chuckle. "Look, we're all here because we love the outdoors. We love our jobs. But if you stick around long enough, you're going to see some things that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the wilderness. Just stick to the trails. Don't go off alone, and if you ever see something you can't explain, maybe don't try to. Sometimes it's better not to know." The rest of us nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over the group like a heavy fog. After a long pause, we started exchanging nervous glances, muttering about how there was clearly more to the woods than any of us had realized. One of the more seasoned rangers, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "You boys ever heard of David Polides?" A few of us nodded. "Yeah, the missing 411 guy, right?" someone said. "Exactly," the veteran ranger replied. "His work touches on a lot of what we've been talking about tonight. Unexplained disappearances in national parks. People vanishing without a trace, only to turn up in places that don't make sense, like that kid stuffed in the rock. You start digging into his research, and you'll find a lot of cases that resonate with what we've seen out here." He paused, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "The thing is, the parks and forests do their best to keep all this under wraps. They don't want people to know about the disappearances or the weird stuff that happens out here. It's bad for business. They'd rather people think the woods are safe, as long as they stick to the trails." We all nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. We loved the job, the wilderness, and the solitude. But we also knew that the woods were never truly safe. Not completely. Jenny looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of how her words sent chills down my spine. "He took us to his house," she said softly, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "It was in the woods, where the trees get really close together. He said he had games to play, and funny animals to show us." My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. A house in the woods? Funny animals? The Fox Man? None of this made sense, but I kept my voice steady. "And did you play the games?" I asked, my throat dry. Jenny nodded, her expression still blank, almost as if she was recalling a pleasant memory. "Yeah, Matthew played a little, but then he got tired. He didn't like the games as much as me, so the Fox Man took him to see the funny animals. I stayed and played by myself for a while." "Jenny," I said, slowly forcing myself to breathe steadily, "where is Matthew now?" "Do you know where the Fox Man took him?" She hesitated for a moment, then looked into the distance as if trying to remember something far away. "He went deeper into the woods," she said softly. "The funny animals took him. They said he'd be safe there." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of her words. "Funny animals," I repeated, trying to stay calm. "What did they look like?" She frowned as if the question confused her. "They weren't like animals, really. They had arms and legs like us, but their faces were strange, like they were wearing masks, but the masks moved." She said this with the casualness of a child describing a strange dream. I shivered, my skin crawling. "And the Fox Man?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. "What did he look like?" Jenny smiled, as if remembering a friendly face. "He looked like a person, but he had a fox's head. Not like a mask, though. His face moved, like a real fox, but he stood like you do. He was nice. He said he would take care of us." I felt sick to my stomach, trying to process her innocent description. There was no way any of this could be real. But here she was, safe, sound, and completely untouched after 5 days alone in the wilderness. It didn't make sense. "Jenny," I said quietly, trying to stay gentle. "Did Matthew go with the Fox Man? Is he with the funny animals now?" She looked down at her hands, then back up at me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think so. He didn't want to play anymore." My chest tightened, a deep dread creeping into my bones. I had to get more information, but I didn't want to push her too hard. "Did the Fox Man say when Matthew would come back?" I asked softly. Jenny shook her head slowly. He said Matthew had to stay with the funny animals, but I had to go back. Before I could ask anything else, her mother returned, visibly shaken but holding herself together. She sat down beside Jenny, pulling her close. I sat there, trying to make sense of what I just heard. The Foxman. Funny animals. It sounded like a child's dream, but the way Jenny spoke, so calm, so sure, made my blood run cold. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Just then, the radio on my hip crackled to life. Dave, this is Chris. We're out here at the spot where Jenny said they came from. No sign of Matthew yet, but we're still looking. Over. I pressed the button, my voice steadier than I felt. Copy that. Jenny's safe and with her mother. Keep me posted. Over. I glanced over at Jenny, who was now resting her head against her mother's shoulder. She looked peaceful, like she hadn't just told me the most disturbing story I'd ever heard. What happened out there, I thought, the weight of her words settling heavily on my chest. And where's Matthew? That night, as the search continued and the camp quieted down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was lurking in those woods, something beyond our understanding. I kept thinking about Jenny's words, her calm description of the Foxman and the funny animals, and the cold, eerie stillness of the woods around us. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to sleep that night. I told myself that it was just the wind playing tricks on me, that my mind was stuck on that conversation with Jenny and her eerie descriptions of the funny animals and the Foxman. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the whistling continued. It was faint at first, but as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, more distinct, like someone, or something, was standing right outside my tower. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The tune. I recognized it. It was The Wheels on the Bus. The same melody Jenny had described. My blood ran cold as I listened, realizing this wasn't just some stray breeze in the trees. It was deliberate, haunting. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, making my way to the window. I peered out into the pitch-black forest below, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The trees swayed gently in the night, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the whistling persisted, echoing up from the woods like a taunt as if it were waiting for me to react. For a moment, I considered grabbing my Glock, but I hesitated. If it was nothing, I'd look like a fool, jumping at shadows and sounds. But if it was something, or if it was what Jenny had described, I wasn't sure a gun would do much good anyway. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I stood there, frozen, every nerve in my body on high alert. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any other sounds, footsteps, rustling, anything that would confirm my fears. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the tower. My heart nearly stopped. The knock wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from beneath the floor, as if someone, or something, was down below, knocking from the ground under the tower. I slowly backed away from the window, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal, a person, or something else entirely? I reached for the radio, fumbling to get it in my hands. This is Dave. Calling base. Does anyone copy? Over. My voice was shaky, and I cursed myself for sounding so panicked. There was a long stretch of static before I finally heard Bill's familiar voice on the other end. Dave? What's going on? Over. I think there's someone outside the tower, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I'm hearing noises, weird noises, and now there's knocking. It's coming from under the tower. Over. Bill paused for a second, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice when he responded. It's probably just the wind or some animal messing around. You're in the middle of nowhere, Dave. Happens all the time. Stay calm and stay inside. I'll check in with you in the morning. Over. I clenched the radio tighter, frustrated by his dismissal. No, Bill, this isn't just the wind. I know what I heard. There's someone out there. Over. Another long pause. All right, just sit tight, Dave. Don't go outside. Lock the door. Stay inside the tower. I'll send someone to check on you in the morning. Over. I didn't like the idea of waiting until morning, but I had no other choice. Copy that. Over. I set the radio down and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I walked over to the small table in the corner of the room and sat down, trying to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the creeping dread. I grabbed one of the books Bill had brought me, flipping it open at random, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept wandering back to Jenny, to her innocent voice recounting the horrors she had seen. And then I heard it again, the whistling. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the stairs leading up to the tower. I stood up, heart racing, as I listened to the slow, steady tune of the wheels on the bus creeping closer and closer. Something was climbing the stairs. Something that didn't belong. I grabbed my Glock this time, my hands trembling as I aimed it toward the door. My eyes were locked on the handle, waiting for it to turn, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. The whistling stopped, and then the handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. The door creaked open just an inch, and I waited, breathless, as the darkness beyond the door seemed to stretch into eternity. But nothing came through. The door remained ajar, the empty space beyond it more terrifying than any figure I could have imagined. And then, a voice. Faint, muffled, like it was speaking through a rag or mask. Give me your face. I froze. The words sent a chill through my entire body. Give me your face, the voice repeated a little louder this time. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at the door, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet glued to the floor. The voice grew quieter, more distant, as if it were retreating back down the stairs. Give me your face. And then, silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the voice to return, waiting for the nightmare to end. But it never did. It was only later, as dawn broke and the sun's light filtered through the trees, that I finally dared to close the door. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but the discomfort was what really gnawed at my nerves. It felt like the bed had something underneath it, like a lump in the mattress that made sleeping nearly impossible. I climbed off the bed, determined to fix whatever was poking into my back. Grabbing the mattress, I lifted it, and immediately, I found the cause. Tucked between the wooden slats beneath the mattress were 2 VHS tapes and a small ledger. My confusion deepened as I pulled them out, placing them on the bedside table. The mattress settled perfectly back into place, but my mind was spinning, trying to figure out why someone would hide tapes and a ledger in such an obscure spot. I sat back down on the bed, picking up the VHS tapes. They were worn, the labels faded, clearly old even for their time. I didn't have a VHS player, so watching them wasn't an option at the moment. With that in mind, I turned my attention to the ledger. Its cover was a dark green leather, with a cluster of white pages held together by a black elastic strap. It had a strange weight to it, as if whatever was written inside held some significance. Turning on the small bedside lamp, I undid the strap and opened the first page. A single ominous message was written in the center. For anyone who reads this, please read with caution. Heed what I have written, as I have survived this long. But if you find this before I can give it to you, be careful. I wasn't able to finish it. The unsettling words made me sit up straight, my senses immediately heightened. I turned the page, revealing a full sheet of cramped handwriting. Curious, I bent the book slightly, letting the pages flip past like a flip book. 2 things became immediately clear. The entire journal was full, save for the last 2 pages, and the handwriting grew increasingly erratic and desperate as the entries went on. I quickly flipped to the very last page, my heart skipping a beat as I read the final 2 words. She's here. A chill ran down my spine. Something about those words, scribbled in frantic handwriting, felt too real. My mind raced, and I hurriedly turned back to the first page, determined to understand what had happened. The journal began. My name is Mark Ellis. I was a fire watcher. I was stationed in Tower 5, located in the Black Hills of the Black Elk Wilderness. And if you are here, attempting to do my job because I am gone, then there are things you need to know in order to survive. Things that will help you see the next morning. Because, believe me, they are out there. She is out there, waiting, watching, pushing, trying to get you to make a mistake. One mistake, and you belong to her. The words were enough to make my skin crawl. Who was she? I kept reading, but Mark's warnings became more cryptic the further I got into the journal. She's near her house now, and she does not want you here. What house? Was this connected to Jenny's story about the funny animals and the house in the woods? My mind scrambled for explanations as I absorbed every word. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Mark had clearly been terrified, paranoid even. But was he just losing his mind from the isolation, or was there something more? I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that settled over me as I read his account. Unable to shake the unease, I grabbed my laptop and opened a new document. I needed to start documenting everything I'd experienced, everything I'd seen and heard since taking this post. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But what if it wasn't? I began typing, chronicling everything from the moment I arrived at the tower. The strange noises, the whistling that seemed to mimic a child's song, Jenny's story about the Foxman. It all seemed to be connected, somehow, though I didn't yet understand how. As I typed, I felt the weight of the journal beside me, a reminder that whatever had happened to Mark could very well happen to me if I wasn't careful. I had no idea what I was up against, but I wasn't going to sit back and wait for it to come to me. I paused for a moment, staring out the window into the pitch-black forest beyond. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and eerie under the dim moonlight. Somewhere out there, something was watching. I would update my journal as soon as I knew more, as soon as I had answers. But for now, I would remain vigilant. I had to. Because if Mark was right, one mistake was all it would take for me to disappear into those woods. Just like him. I'll keep you posted.